Well, good morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be back at Minds and Money in this great city of London, where on the 18th of December, football is coming home. You heard it here first. You see, one of the reasons why I always look forward to Minds and Money at this time of the year is because the organizers have this habit of sliding their fingernails under the most pressing issues that face our industry. And this year, in calling it Resourcing Tomorrow, they've done just that. Because I think Resourcing Tomorrow captures a challenge that is not just for our industry, but for people that are all affected by it. And so when I was asked to speak to you about why Resourcing Tomorrow matters not just to the industry, but to everybody, I did what conference organizers hate. I changed the title. Actually, I changed the title only very slightly, but it makes a big difference. And I added an S to the end of tomorrow, making it plural, tomorrows. Now you see, I'm, unlike our venerable Prime Minister, not a British private educated fella. So even I know that that's bad grammar, saying tomorrows. But actually, if you allow me some grammatical license, I want to make the case to you in the next 10 or 15 minutes that only by thinking about resourcing tomorrows, multiple, do I think we have a hope of changing the relationship between mining and society. Now, if you're not convinced that that's a useful exercise, consider for a moment that all of us here, in all our diversity, don't even experience the present as one. Our lived reality about the present actually is a big function of the color of our skin, the class we belong to, our gender. And if Black Lives Matter taught us anything, it is that your experience of a black person in South Africa, in the UK, or the US is very different than that of a white person. And actually, my friend Eduardo from Vale, the chief executive, has this wonderful saying where he says, in Brazil, even the past is uncertain. And it's very true if you know Brazil, but it's also true more generally, because as we know, actually, how the past is written can lead to very different sets of understandings of where we've come from. And if you don't believe me, I've got a book on colonial history to sell you for some diamonds. So the point I want to make to you is that actually, if we don't even have the same experience of the present or the past, if we don't keep in the front of our minds that our experience of the future is likely to be very different depending on where we come from, we will not successfully resource tomorrow, because it is tomorrows. In fact, I think it is 5 tomorrows. So what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes is tell you what I think the tomorrow looks like for 5 important groups, and how we're going to have to keep that in our minds as we plan what the future of our industry looks like. So the 5 groups are communities, governments, workers, investors, and mining companies. So, actually, in saying that, I thought I might even start my speech today by saying, today, I feel like a mine worker. Today, I feel like an investor. Now, I see 80% of the room didn't get that joke, which tells me that you've been doing something better with your lives than watching the Football World Cup. So I encourage you to go back and Google the Giovanni Infantino speech, and suddenly what I just said will make sense and will make you cringe. But really, it is those 5 groups that I want to go through. So let me start with communities and what tomorrow for communities looks like. I think the most important thing we can keep in mind when we imagine what tomorrow for communities, and by this I mean communities living in and around mining operations, is that there is no single tomorrow for communities around the world. And for too long, perhaps, what we have assumed is that what worked for one community, a vision of the future with brick houses and plumbing and a school and a hospital, is exactly the same future that a community may want in a different part of the world. And I think that's a mistake. And so the best thing we can do as we keep in mind what the future of tomorrow for communities looks like is to take the time to understand what their own vision of tomorrow for them looks like, and to then be a partner in that development. And that might lead to some answers that aren't obvious when we look at the picture from the vantage point that we've always done before. In some cases, actually, communities say, Very happy for you to mine here, but could you mine slower for longer? That would work much better for us than if you mined intensively for 30 years. Can we sit with that discomfort and plan what tomorrow looks like based on that kind of feedback? I just want to give you, with each of these groups, a couple of examples of how I think the industry has individually and collectively responded to this sort of a challenge, and how we're going to need more of that for the future. So in the case of communities, I would argue that the way the industry responded around COVID-19 is a great example of what tomorrow can and should look like with the industry partnering with communities. Countless examples of mining companies making medical facilities available not just to their workers but to community members, of supporting vaccine rollouts, of partnering with governments to procure PPE. These are examples of making sure that we sit alongside communities and be there in their times of need. Maybe just one very specific example of how I believe a company has taken the time to understand what tomorrow looks like for a community and work with that. Now, this would be Tech, a member of ICMM, and their project QB2 in Chile, which represents the first agreement with indigenous communities in the Chilean mining industry. And that's because that's what the indigenous communities in Chile wanted, and so that's what Tech has done. And that's an example of bold individual action that I think has to be the future of tomorrow for communities working in partnership with the mining industry. A great example of collective action when it comes to the future for communities is what we as ICMM members, 26 companies representing 1/3 of the global mining industry, have done, that from next year, or from 2024 instead, we're going to be reporting consistently the social and economic benefit that we create for local communities in a transparent, consistent way across 8 key indicators. That is our responsibility and obligation to make sure that communities understand the social and economic contribution that we make. So that's communities, and how, by looking at what tomorrow looks like for communities, we have a better chance of resourcing the future. Secondly, governments. Now, when you look at what tomorrow feels like for governments, the word that comes to mind is uncertain. And if you don't believe me, ask Mr. Kwasi Kwarteng and his friend Liz Truss. But the reality is that governments around the world are facing a cost of living crisis. They're facing a situation of post-COVID recoveries that are uncertain, and of course, increased geopolitical tensions. And here, what governments are looking for when they look to tomorrow is a partner in our industry that's going to help them achieve their development goals. Can we do that? Can we be the partners to both meet their geostrategic ambitions, especially when it comes to critical minerals, and bring development to some of the most impoverished parts of their countries, which is often where mining occurs? I believe we can. And I believe there are plenty of examples of how the industry has partnered with governments to do just that. I spoke about, for example, our response on COVID. Let me give you another specific example. The work that Anglo American is doing, another ICMM member, in building out South Africa's renewable energy infrastructure is not just an investment in their own future and securing their own supplies of low-carbon energy. Instead, it is going a long way in solving a chronic crisis of power generation in South Africa. And that is an example of the kind of partnership that the industry and governments can create. And then collectively, we as ICMM members believe that a cornerstone of a productive development partnership between the government and our industry is based on the principle of transparency. And that is why last year we made 2 landmark commitments as ICMM. The first was that we would make our contracts with governments public, whether or not those governments had signed up to the Extractors Industry Transparency Initiative, or EITI, of which we're a big supporter in any event. The second commitment was that we would start reporting the tax payments we make on a country-by-country basis. We believe that both these commitments on transparency are fundamentally important to building a productive relationship between the industry and governments well into the future. So that's the second set of tomorrows for governments. The third is about mine workers. And here, I think, of course, the key challenge that we face in building a prosperous tomorrow when it comes to workers in our industry is ensuring, first and foremost, an industry that is not just physically safe, and we have a lot of work to do to get to a position where everybody goes home at the end of their workday, but also an industry that is psychologically safe, free of bullying, free of harassment, and certainly free of assault. And again, we know we have a long way to go. We also have a responsibility to partner with workers to make sure that they can transition through multiple careers as their world of work changes. And so let me give you a couple of examples here of how both individually and collectively we as an industry have been responding. Individually, I'd like to single out the leadership demonstrated by Rio Tinto, another member of ICMM. Some of you will have read the Everyday Respect report that was released by Rio Tinto earlier this year, an independent assessment of workplace behaviors in Rio Tinto's operations globally. It was really painful reading. It showed unacceptable levels of sexual assault, harassment, and bullying across Rio Tinto's operations. And I think the leadership demonstrated by Rio Tinto to make that public, together with the actions that they are taking as a response to it, is exactly the kind of basis on which the future of workers in our industry can and should be built. And in response, we collectively, as the group of 26 companies that make up ICMM, made a series of very important changes to our mining principles that are a condition of membership that will ensure that every company that operates in the ICMM group will be taking very specific steps to ensure that we help create a diverse, inclusive, and equitable workforce. So that's what tomorrow looks like when it comes to workers in our industry. Fourthly, what does tomorrow look like for investors? Now, arguably, you would be saying, of course, investors expect a decent and stable rate of return. But as we know, the pressure on investors to invest responsibly and follow principles of ESG, or environment, social, and governance, means that we have an obligation to create a tomorrow where investors who invest in our sector can do so and meet, if not exceed, the ESG expectations on them. And here again, let me call out a few examples. We know, for example, that many investors now deeply care about making sure that the companies they invest in make nature or biodiversity better, not worse. And here some of you will have seen the announcement from another ICMM member company, Vale, just last week, where Vale is partnering with other companies in Brazil, together with the government, to protect 4 million hectares of land, alongside protecting 1 million hectares themselves. That's an example of how our industry is responding to a global crisis, but in a way that helps meet the expectations of investors from an ESG perspective too. And collectively, we've worked very closely with the investor community to address a fundamentally important issue, which is of tailings management. Following the disaster in Brumadinho, ICMM worked together with UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, and PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, to develop the global industry standard on tailings management, which is now a clear condition of membership for ICMM companies, but importantly, has become the standard for managing tailings facilities everywhere. That's an example of how investors and companies are working together to shape a positive tomorrow. Then finally, what does tomorrow look like for mining companies? Well, actually, you would say that we can't do any of the first four. We can't create any of the first four tomorrows, whether that's for communities, workers, governments, or investors, until we figure out how to create a positive future and a tomorrow for the mining industry. And here, of course, what you would expect a tomorrow for the mining companies to look like would be one where not only do companies enjoy a legal license to operate with much faster and more streamlined permitting than what we currently have, but also a positive social license to operate. And that the sector's financial standing, as reflected, for example, in multiples, shows the value that the sector adds in practice. Now here, of course, there are precious few examples that I can point to of where actually this has all come together to create an environment in which mining companies feel that the actions they have taken are being adequately recognized and rewarded. But there are some. So we have seen, for example, governments come and support the mining industry in a way that we haven't heard until 18 months ago. And that's, of course, the direct result of the increased recognition of the role that critical minerals play. We've even seen governments take direct equity stakes in mining companies. And we've seen positive experiences, for example, in Indonesia, where local communities are standing up and supporting mining companies and preventing protesters from affecting the operations of mining companies because they believe that that specific operation in that specific jurisdiction by that specific company is doing a good job. So there you have it. It's not resourcing tomorrow, it's resourcing tomorrows. I hope, Andrew, I haven't given you too much of a heart attack by changing the title of your presentation. But as I said to you initially, if we don't keep in mind that tomorrow needs to look and will look differently, depending on which seat you sit in, I don't believe we have a hope of being able to resource the future. And that presents a leadership challenge unlike anything we have faced before. So can we do it? Well, I'm looking here at my good friend, His Excellency the Vice Minister Khalid Al-Mudaifer, who you will hear from later. And when I think to myself, can we do it? I think Saudi Arabia beat Argentina. So maybe we can do it. Anything is possible. Thank you very much.